We're going to continue where we've left off. Who can remember what the subject was last time?
It was about Galatians, wasn't it? If we're in Galatians, we were talking about Paul having to go out because some were saying he needed to be circumcised, and he was explaining how he'd gone for 14 years and he'd come back and his gospel had been given to him by Christ and not by other teachers.
I'm going to leave it there. Yes, we were talking about that. If you didn't get that, we were talking about we're in Galatians, okay, and Paul, and I say this, I want to encourage you to, I've been reading some of these letters. There's some of these letters you think to yourself from Paul, okay, he's writing to a church in Galatia. Now Galatia is a big place, okay, it's like Greater Manchester. Think of it in that context. And he's not just writing to the church in Greater Manchester, he's writing to the whole church in Greater Manchester. How many churches are there in Greater Manchester? Quite a few. So he's writing, Paul isn't just writing to one particular church, he's writing to the church, a body of believers that believe that Christ died for them and they have come to faith because of that. Okay? Knowing that Jesus Christ went to the cross, gave his life, but then on the third day he rose again. And that is what the core of their faith, that is what they're believing. But we were also looking at the fact that in Galatia at the time, there were many, many Jews. And the Jewish people who came to faith are saying, right, okay, but we've got our customs. We've got our customs. This is how we do it. Paul himself was a Jew. Peter himself was a Jew. And yet what they're trying to do now is, when you come to faith in Jesus Christ, you have the freedom, not to do what you want, but the freedom to know that he's saved you, and there's nothing you can do about it. He's given you this free gift of eternal life, and there's nothing you can do about it. But the church leaders, certain church leaders, and certain people within the church who are influencing decisions within the church and saying, well, actually, no, we're Jews. We don't do it this way. We've had to do this. We've had to abide by this law, this thing that we've had for centuries. We can't change it overnight. Oh, by the way, if you want to be a Christian and you're not a non-Jew, you have to do what we were doing. That's basically what they were saying. And so Paul is addressing this within the church in Galatia. In fact, if you look at certainly with all the words, all the letters, Paul is addressing a lot of these issues in a lot of places of things that you have to do, but you actually don't have to do. But people are saying you do. That's basically what he's saying. So we're picking it up in Galatians chapter 3. I'm going to read quite a big chunk of scripture, okay? Because I want you to get an understanding of the letter that Paul is actually writing. I'm not going to read the whole letter, because if I was doing that, I'd be reading 5 chapters. It would be way past time. But I will actually read quite a bit of Galatians in just a minute. So we were looking at the last time we were together, we were looking at what I would perhaps call the authenticity of the gospel. The gospel is authentic in every way. There's nothing we can do about it. There's nothing we can change about it. It is authentic. It is real. There's nothing you can alter. It's authentic. And today we're actually looking at the superiority of the gospel. And by that I mean the difference between what was law, what the Jews believed, and also what Christ came and changed. And one is superior to the other. And when Christ came, he made true faith in him superior to that of what you actually have to do. So that is what we're going to be looking at this morning. And I want to just so we understand where we're at. But also to understand that within our own lives, on a day-by-day basis, what are the things that are superior to what we think, what we do? Is our family superior to our faith? Is our job superior? Is our cars, the property, our holidays, all those things, do we put them above Jesus? It's a question for every single one of us to ask. What is our priority in our lives when it comes to our faith and the way that we behave? And so this is what we're talking about here this morning. We look at how to look at the gospel is superior to that of the law, the things that you have to do to attain forgiveness, those things which some would say are the requirements of the Christian should be, both in action and deed. So, who's ever been called a hypocrite as a Christian? Has anybody actually come up to you and say, well, you're a hypocrite?
Yeah, I'm married.
And you know, and that's what I keep saying, and it's not just about what we say, it's about how we live. How we live speaks more volumes to the people that we live with, to the people we work with, to people we associate with, than actually our words. Because you can say something and do completely something else. And people are watching it constantly. And what was happening here is people were doing something but actually saying something completely different. And people look at those things. So it's more important for us to look at those. Paul, just like Jesus in Matthew 5, wasn't saying that the law didn't apply anymore once you became a Christian, but just certain parts of the law of which were no longer required. Is that confusing? Let me clarify. Okay, let me clarify. The law of Moses were given to the people of Israel. They weren't given to people that weren't from Israel. Let's just clarify that. Are you from Israel?
Not the nation.
No. Are you from Israel? Joan? Israel. That's typical northern accent. That's an answer. No, we're not from Israel. We're not from the faith of how, from how and who you were given these laws of how to live. So I just want to clarify a few things. Okay, so I'm going to split it into three sections. The law of Moses is split into three sections. First off, you've got the ceremonial law. Now, those that have joined us on Wednesday night, and if you take the questions home from the questions from our studies that we've been doing, we were talking a lot about ceremonial law. And most of the ceremonial law was around sacrifices. How we dress, or how they dressed. How they behaved. One of the things was, you know, why did one of the two of the sons get burnt to death? Because he didn't abide by the letter of the law. This is how Moses said it had to be done, and Moses was instructed by God, and they just like, well, there you go, mate. Bang, gone. Carried off by their own other brothers, and by others. So there were certain things that were held to account on certain things that they had to do within that ceremonial law. Most of these were primarily were how people worshipped. They pointed forward towards Jesus. These are no longer required once Jesus came. So when we talk about sacrifices, and if you look in the Old Testament, loads and loads of sacrifices. And yet, Jesus in the New Testament was the ultimate sacrifice. So everything pointed back from Adam all the way to the cross. So all those things in the whole of the Old Testament, the ceremonial law, were no longer relevant. Jesus was the ultimate sacrifice. So the things that you had to do the sacrifice were no longer required. Does that make sense? Okay? However, I will say this. The principles of worshipping and loving God are still relevant. They did it because they loved God. They did it because they worshipped God. So those sections, even though it's ceremonial, are still relevant to us today. Because what have we been doing this morning? We've been worshipping God. We've been loving God with our worship. And so those things are still relevant. Okay, then we have the second part, which is civil law. Okay, the civil law. Ceremonial law first, then civil law. Now we all know what civil law is. Abiding by the law of the country. Those things that we have to do. Okay, this is to do with the Israel's daily living. Cultures are different today. Let me just clarify that. We live in a different culture than what Israel lived in then. Yeah? Would you say that? We live in Manchester, well, we live in part of Lancashire, part of Wigan, part of the northwest of England, and a totally different country to Israel. So the cultures that we have are different to what they grew up in, so those have a lot to do with the civil law. Our laws are different. Our courts give us civil laws that are different to those. Yeah? I don't think they have a speed limit of 30 miles an hour. They might have, I don't know. But there are certain guidelines, certain principles that we need today that guide the way that we live and are toward each other. And these are good for us because they promote unity. There's laws, principles within the church that you don't talk badly about each other. There are certain principles that you do certain things and don't do other certain things because it causes offence or has the potential to cause offence. So there are certain things that we can and can't do really within the church. There are things that are acceptable and things that are not. And that is part and parcel of what we class as the civil law. And just like today, just like in society, there are certain things that are acceptable within society and certain things that aren't. Some are written, some are unwritten. You just don't do it. And so it is with each individual family. Each individual family. Now, who's got brothers and sisters? Yeah. Brothers and sisters. Yeah. Have those brothers and sisters got their own families? Yeah. Do they do the same as you? Do they do the same as what your parents used to do? Sometimes. It's an interesting one, this, because, I've got 3 brothers, but my sister's got 4. Come on. But every single one of us, as 3 brothers and a sister, we each have our own different families with children and all the rest of it. But every single one of us does things differently to the other. So what is acceptable within one family isn't necessarily acceptable or doesn't really work in that other family. Okay? So, again, but we very often, how often are we like this? Well, we don't do it like that. So there's some things that are acceptable, some things that aren't. And some things are perfectly acceptable, but within that context of that family unit or that particular country, for instance. Okay, then we've got the third section, which is moral law. Now, the moral law is important because the moral law doesn't change. So we've got the ceremonial law. Okay? The things that Israel used to do to attain forgiveness through sacrifice. Jesus came, gone. They still worship God, we still worship God, we still love God, they still love God. Those principles are the same. But the actual things they physically did from year to year, gone. Don't need them anymore. Jesus came. Then we have the civil law of our daily living, the things that the laws, the general laws that we have day by day. And then we have the moral laws. Now these are important. These are really important. The type of law, this type of law is a direct command from God. This is reflected in the Old Testament commands, which Jesus then simplified for us in the commandments which he gave us. And he only gave us 2. Hang on a minute, there were 10 commandments, weren't there? Can we name them? But Jesus gave us 2. And he only gave us 2, why? Because if he only gave us 2, the reason for those 2 is because they covered the rest. Okay, so do not kill, do not steal, do not speak badly of somebody, false witness and all the rest of it. But then, if you love each other, you won't do it anyway. Simple. Very simple. But these commands are also the ones that make us holy. They make us righteous. Because if we love each other as Christ loved us, and if we love God, which should be our heart's desire to do, then God will make us holy. God will make us righteous before him. We sang a song earlier before, and it was talking about robes of white. And it was talking about the bride of Christ becoming holy. That's us. That's us. So, that's page 105. I'll pick this up another time. But we will move on. Okay, so we're going to, in fact, to do with that law that Jesus actually did, the commandments, if you look into Matthew 22:37 to 40, I use again that New Living Translation, it says this: Jesus replied, "You must love the Lord your God with all your heart, or your soul, or your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. The second is equally important: love your neighbour as yourself. The entire law and all the demands of the prophets are based on these 2 commandments." When they talk about the entire law, we're talking about the integrity, so the entire 10 commandments that were given to Moses and to the people. This reveals the nature and will of God. If you love me, you'll love each other. It's the nature and will of God, and that still applies to us today. And we don't do it to attain salvation, by the way.
No.
This isn't a case of, Susanna's already briefly. We would never get it. Oh yeah, love the Lord your God, yeah, well I failed. Love each other, oh, I hate it. Hate that hairstyle my wife's got.
Oh,
I don't. She knows I don't. But you get the point. If we love each other, we do that, why? Because we love God. That's not to attain salvation, but to live in ways that are pleasing to God. That's why we do it. We do it because we love God, we want to please him. That's our introduction, guys. And I've got 5 minutes from the back. Okay. The superiority of the gospel is simple. The things we do that we think that we can attain God to please us or attain salvation, the things we do. How many of us actually grew up, well, if you do this, this will happen. Yeah, look at parents, for argument's sake. Just look at your parents.
Don't touch that, you get burned.
Don't touch that, you get burnt. I'm talking about the other things like, well, if you do this, something nice will happen. Or if you do this, I'll give you some sweets. Or all those sorts of things. You know, the things that we grew up with, like you say, don't touch, you'll get burnt. Okay, that's a consequence of doing something you didn't ought to. But I'm talking about the other side where you do things to make people happy. Classic this morning, I was at work. My wife pretended to be asleep. I wife pretended to be asleep. She pretended to be asleep when my daughter came up the stairs with a cup of tea. I know, she didn't. She pretended to be asleep when she came up. Then realised that actually after she'd gone and closed the door, there was a cup of tea there. Did she do that to please her, or did she do it because she loved her? I would say both.
Oh, yeah, right. Yeah, but
Did it to please her and did it to love her? Hopefully she didn't hear what I was saying. Just embarrassed my wife.
I'm not supposed to do that.
Paul tries to address the issues within the church. These are big issues. They're still going on about circumcision. Still going on about it. We went all the way through Galatians. We've done Thessalonians. We've done Colossians. And still, Paul is writing to another area of the country with the same issues. But actually, you've got to do this. You've got to do this. I don't know why Paul didn't just change the heading of the place he was sending it to. Or you would have saved yourself something, just duplicate it and then just change the heading, like Ephesus, Colossians, Lee. But Paul here was trying to get to the point of saying that the gospel, the real gospel, the gospel that Jesus came, died, gave of himself, on the third day rose again, was a sacrifice for each and every one. And that went straight to the top of the list. How do we attain salvation? How do we attain that place where before we were condemned to death by the things that we had to do? It didn't bring life, they just brought death. How do we go from that point to actually being a Christian and saying, actually, Lord, I want to know you. I want to have that life where you are in me. I want to live a life where I love you, but I don't want to be having to go through rigorous things where I have to do things to attain it. It was a free gospel. A free gospel. I said right at the beginning, there is nothing you can do to attain salvation. Nothing. There's nothing you can do that will make you right before God. Nothing. God did what he did for each and every one of us. All we have to do is accept it. And say, Jesus, come into my life. I want to follow you. I want to do what you want me to do. I want to please you. I want to love you. The superiority of the gospel is that is what is paramount. The superiority of the gospel is the fact that we have faith in Jesus Christ, and he says, come children, come to me. Oh, by the way, you don't have to do anything. No chores. You don't have to make a cup of tea to get your mum to love you and to be pleased with you. But you can still do it anyway. And we're the same with our faith. We come to Jesus, and Jesus says, come on then. I've paid the price. I've made the sacrifice. All you have to do is accept it. It's on offer to each and every one of us. That is the beauty of the good news, the gospel that Jesus gives to us. I'm going to finish there. And we will pick this up next time.